The soft, golden light of the evening streamed through the large windows of Megan's living room, stretching long, lazy shadows across the gleaming hardwood floors. The fading sun bathed the room in a warm glow, but Megan felt nothing but a cold, hollow emptiness inside. She sat curled up on the couch, clutching a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The steam had vanished, leaving only the cool ceramic to remind her of the warmth it once held, a warmth that had faded, just like the unshakable certainty she used to feel in her marriage. For years, Ethan had been her rock. Quiet in his affection, steady in his reliability, he was the kind of man who showed love through actions, not grand gestures. Megan had never doubted his devotion. Their 5 years of marriage had been marked by a comforting, predictable rhythm that made her feel secure. But lately, over the past few months, something had changed. At first, it was subtle, barely noticeable, like the slow shift from summer to fall. Now, it felt like a weight pressing down on her chest, heavy and unrelenting, no matter how hard she tried to ignore it. Megan had tried to rationalize it, to explain away the unease gnawing at her heart. Ethan's late nights at the office, his distracted answers to her questions, the way he'd quickly flip his phone screen down when she walked into the room, she told herself it was just stress. Everyone goes through rough patches, right? Maybe this was just a phase, a necessary distance for them to grow individually. But no matter how much she tried to convince herself, the sinking feeling in her gut only grew louder, more insistent. It was a feeling she couldn't shake, no matter how hard she tried. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping her out of her spiraling thoughts. Megan picked it up and glanced at the message. It was from Olivia. Can't make it tonight. Work stuff. Rain check. Megan sighed, her brow furrowing. This was the third time in just a few weeks that Olivia had cancelled plans last minute. They'd been inseparable since college, sharing everything from late-night movie marathons to spontaneous road trips, confiding in each other over glasses of wine and moments of vulnerability. But now, for reasons Megan couldn't quite understand, Olivia seemed to be pulling away. And it didn't escape her notice that Olivia's distance seemed to coincide with Ethan's growing aloofness. Was it just a coincidence, or was there something more going on? Megan shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. Paranoia was a dangerous thing, and she knew better than to let it cloud her judgment. Olivia was her best friend, her confidant, and Ethan was her husband, the man she'd vowed to spend her life with. She couldn't let suspicion drive a wedge between them. Just as she was trying to gather her scattered thoughts, she heard the sound of a key turning in the front door. Megan's heart skipped a beat as she straightened up on the couch. The door opened, and Ethan walked in, his presence filling the room. He loosened his tie, his movements calm and practiced. "Hey," he said, his voice smooth and steady, giving no hint of the tension that had been building in Megan's chest. She watched him carefully, her eyes searching his face for any sign of guilt, hesitation, or even a crack in his composure. But his expression was unreadable, neutral, almost too composed. It was a mask of normalcy that only deepened the unease in her heart. Megan felt a tightness in her throat, a lump she couldn't swallow. "You're home early," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "Meeting got cancelled." She glanced at the clock. "You didn't call." He shrugged. "Didn't think it mattered." He leaned down and kissed the top of her head, a gesture that felt more routine than affectionate, then disappeared into the bedroom without another word. Megan exhaled slowly, trying to calm the storm of thoughts raging in her mind. Maybe she was overthinking things. Maybe her own insecurities were poisoning her thoughts. But once doubt took root, it was hard to shake. 2 nights later, they attended a small dinner gathering at a friend's house. The laughter was easy, the wine flowed freely, but Megan couldn't shake the feeling of distraction. Her eyes kept drifting to Ethan, who sat across the room, deep in conversation with Liam. Liam was Ethan's oldest friend, a loud, straightforward guy who never seemed to filter his words. He turned to Megan, his eyes bright from the wine, and said with a grin, "You know, I ran into Ethan the other day. Thought he was meeting you for lunch, but turns out it was Olivia." The air in the room seemed to shift. Megan felt the weight of his words settle in her chest, stealing her breath. Ethan's head snapped up, but Liam just chuckled, oblivious. That little cafe on Oak Street, you know the one? I waved, but you two were deep in conversation. He took another sip of his drink, completely unaware of the tension he'd just unleashed. Megan's fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. She forced a smile, her voice light but strained. I didn't know you and Olivia had lunch together. Ethan's jaw tightened. It was nothing. She was nearby, and we ran into each other. Megan said nothing, but the room seemed to close in around her. The clinking of glasses and murmured conversations faded into the background as she felt like she'd been plunged into ice-cold water. Olivia had cancelled their lunch that day. Megan looked at Ethan, searching for an explanation, for anything that would make sense. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked away. Her stomach twisted. Something was very, very wrong. Later that night, Megan sat in her car, her fingers gripping the steering wheel as she stared at the dimly lit entrance of a hotel. The neon sign flickered, casting a dull glow over the rain-slicked pavement. She'd followed Ethan here on instinct, praying she was wrong. But there was no mistaking the figure that had just walked inside, Olivia. Part of her wanted to stay in the car, to turn around and drive home, to pretend she'd never seen this. But the other part, the part that had spent months drowning in suspicion and doubt, needed the truth. Her legs felt like jelly as she stepped out onto the sidewalk. The lobby was warm, the scent of polished wood and expensive cologne filling her lungs as she walked in. The receptionist barely glanced at her as she passed, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She reached the elevators and pressed the button. It arrived too quickly. Inside, the mirrored walls reflected her pale, anxious face. The mirrored walls of the elevator reflected a woman Megan barely recognized, pale-faced, lips pressed into a tight line, shoulders stiff as if bracing against the weight of what she was about to do. The doors slid open with a soft ding, and she stepped out into the carpeted hallway, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. At the end of the corridor, a door clicked shut softly. Megan walked forward, her pulse roaring like a freight train. Room 417. For a moment, she hesitated, her hand hovering in the air. But then her fingers curled into a fist, and she knocked. Silence. Then footsteps. The door opened just a crack, revealing Olivia wrapped in a hotel robe, her face shifting from confusion to shock in an instant. Megan, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Megan's voice came out sharp, almost unrecognizable. Is Ethan here? Olivia's mouth opened, then closed. Her silence was all the answer Megan needed. She pushed past her, stepping into the room. The air smelled like him, his cologne, his soap, the faint tang of wine. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled. And in that moment, something inside Megan shattered, beyond repair. Ethan emerged from the bathroom, a towel slung around his neck. His expression froze the second he saw her. Megan, he said, his voice low, almost pleading. She let out a laugh, harsh and bitter. You don't get to say my name like that. Not anymore. Olivia hovered near the bed, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to disappear. I didn't mean for this to happen. For you to find out. Megan snapped, her voice trembling with rage. For this to happen? For me to find out? She turned to Ethan, her eyes blazing. How long? He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Megan, let's talk about this somewhere else. How long? A beat of silence. Then, softly, 6 months. Megan's knees nearly gave out. 6 months. While she'd been second-guessing herself, convincing herself she was imagining things, they'd been doing this. She turned to Olivia, her voice cold. You were my best friend. Olivia flinched. I didn't plan this, Megan. It just happened. Megan laughed, hollow and bitter. Right. It just happened. Like you tripped and fell into my husband's bed. Olivia looked away, her face flushed with shame. Ethan took a step closer, but Megan raised a hand to stop him. Don't, she warned. You don't get to comfort me. Not after this. He hesitated, then sighed. I never wanted to hurt you. Megan's chest ached with something raw and unbearable. But you did. And you didn't stop. The weight of their betrayal pressed down on her, suffocating. She'd imagined this confrontation so many times, thought she'd scream, throw things, break something just to make him feel a fraction of what she felt. But now, standing here, all she felt was empty. She turned to the door. Megan, please, Ethan said, his voice cracking. She paused, her hand on the handle. You made your choice, she said, her voice steady now. I'm making mine. And then she walked away. The world outside was moving, but Megan felt suspended in time. The hum of the city pressed against the cafe windows, muffled by the quiet inside. She stirred her coffee absently, watching the swirls of cream dissolve into the blackness. It had been 3 weeks since she'd walked out of that hotel room. 3 weeks since she'd last spoken to Ethan. Yet the weight of it still clung to her, like an old, familiar ache. She'd left without a grand exit, no dramatic outburst, no shattered glass, no pleas for an explanation. Just a door closing behind her, a finality she hadn't realized she was ready for. In the days that followed, Ethan had tried reaching out. At first, it was long-winded texts, then phone calls that went unanswered. Eventually, his messages grew shorter. We need to talk. I'm sorry. Please, Megan. But she had nothing left to say. A chair scraped against the floor, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced up as Liam settled across from her, a cautious look in his eyes. You look better, he said, studying her. She gave a small, tired smile. I feel better. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't a lie, either. The initial storm had passed, the gut-wrenching pain, the sleepless nights spent replaying every moment she'd missed, every sign she'd ignored. What remained was quieter, but still there, lingering beneath the surface. Liam sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I should have kept my mouth shut that night. Megan shook her head. No. You didn't do this. They did. He hesitated, then asked, have you talked to her? Megan's grip tightened around her cup. She hadn't. Olivia had tried, left voicemails, sent messages that Megan deleted before reading. There was nothing left between them, nothing worth salvaging. She made her choice, Megan said simply. And I've made mine. Liam nodded but said nothing. They sat in silence for a moment before he leaned forward, his voice softer. And Ethan? A familiar pang struck her chest, but it was duller now, less like a knife, more like a fading bruise. I'm done, she said, the words steady and certain. He wants to talk, but what's left to say? He cheated. He lied. And he let me believe I was crazy for suspecting it. Liam exhaled, nodding slowly. I don't get why people do this to the ones who love them. Megan had asked herself the same question too many times. There was no satisfying answer. Maybe Ethan had convinced himself he deserved more. Maybe Olivia had justified it by blaming Megan. Or maybe neither of them had thought beyond their own selfishness. It doesn't matter, Megan murmured, the words slipping from her lips almost absently, more to herself than to him. It happened. Now, I have to decide what comes next. The weight of those words, heavy with finality, settled around her like a blanket. And for the first time in what felt like forever, that thought didn't bring the usual wave of terror. Instead, there was a strange calmness, as though a door had gently closed behind her, leaving her standing in a space where the future was yet unwritten. Later that evening, Megan stood on the balcony of her new apartment. The cool night air brushed against her skin, carrying the faint scent of rain. The city sprawled before her like an intricate tapestry, its lights twinkling like stars scattered across a dark sky. Her apartment was small and sparsely furnished, but in that moment, it felt like a sanctuary, a place she could finally call her own. She breathed in deeply, the air fresh and pure, as if the heavens themselves were cleansing the remnants of the past, washing away old mistakes and the weight of what once was. A part of her had imagined she would feel adrift, untethered without Ethan. She had feared that the absence of his presence would leave a gaping hole in her life, as though she had been cut loose from something essential, something that had anchored her for so long. But as she stood there now, alone and embraced by the quiet solitude, she felt something unexpected stir within her, a sense of relief. Not the hollow ache she had anticipated. For so long, she had fought to hold on, to a marriage that had crumbled, to a friendship that had faded, to a version of herself that no longer fit. She had spent endless days trying to patch together the pieces of a life that no longer aligned with who she had become. But now, standing here on this balcony, she realized that she was finally letting go. Not just of Ethan, but of all the old parts of her that no longer served her. She was allowing herself the grace to move on, to shed the layers of past pain and regret. Her phone buzzed on the railing, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced down to see a message from Ethan. "I know I don't deserve it, but I just want to talk." The words echoed in her mind for a moment, the familiar tug of guilt stirring within her. But she didn't linger on them. She stared at the screen for a long, quiet moment, the silence stretching between her and the message, as if the weight of everything unspoken hung in the balance. Then, with a steady breath and without a second thought, she swiped the message away. Her thumb pressed firmly, and the words vanished into the ether. Megan stepped back from the railing, her heart beating in time with the soft rhythm of the night. She inhaled the crisp, cool air once more, and in that moment, she made a choice. She was letting the past slip away, not with a dramatic flourish, but with quiet resolve. The future was wide open, waiting for her to step into it, unburdened and free.